An entire civilization can disappear from history almost without a trace. The Phoenicians built a maritime superpower that dominated the Mediterranean for centuries, perfecting sea travel and gifting the world its first alphabet. Yet their name now echoes only faintly from the ancient past. By the end of this investigation, you will understand the complex web of events that caused this powerful people to fade from the world stage. We will uncover how a society of master navigators lost its way and explore the lingering mystery of a people who vanished not in a single cataclysm, but through a slow erosion of their identity. What does it truly take for a great civilization to be forgotten? Their world was a narrow ribbon of coast, a place where the mountains met the sea and left little room for sprawling kingdoms. This geography forged a unique destiny. Without vast fields for grain, the Phoenician city-states turned their gaze outward to the deep blue horizon. Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos were not united under a single crown but bound by a shared enterprise, the business of trade. They were a civilization of networks, not empires, where power was held by merchant families who commanded fleets rather than armies. Their greatest invention was not just a product, but a vessel, the sturdy galley capable of braving the open ocean. These ships were the lifelines of the ancient world, carrying treasures that were coveted from Egypt to Mesopotamia. The most legendary of these was Tyrian purple, a dye so rare and vibrant it was worth its weight in silver, extracted from thousands of tiny sea snails. Alongside it traveled fragrant cedar wood, flawless glass, and fine wines. To secure these trade routes, they established outposts that grew into powerful colonies, with Carthage rising to become a dominant force in its own right. This sprawling commercial web made them the undisputed masters of the Mediterranean, the indispensable middlemen of the Bronze and Iron Ages. Their entire identity and survival were woven into the fabric of their maritime trade. So what happens when the threads of that fabric begin to unravel? But no empire of the sea, however skilled, can rule the waves forever. The very success of the Phoenicians created a blueprint that others were eager to copy. A new age of naval competition was dawning, and it arrived first with the Greeks. Their sleek triremes, powered by 3 banks of oars, were faster and more aggressive than the sturdy Phoenician trading galleys. These were warships designed for confrontation. Greek colonies began to sprout across the Mediterranean, especially in Sicily and southern Italy, placing them squarely on ancient Phoenician trade routes. Suddenly, the markets for wine, olive oil, and pottery were no longer exclusive. The Phoenicians, who had operated for centuries without true rivals, now faced a powerful, organized force that wanted a piece of their lucrative business. This was no longer just about commerce, it was a direct contest for influence and resources. The pressure intensified dramatically with the ascent of Rome. What began as a regional power on the Italian peninsula quickly grew into a military juggernaut with ambitions that stretched across the entire sea. Rome looked at the Mediterranean and saw a Phoenician world, a network of trade and power that culminated in the mighty city of Carthage. To Rome, Carthage was not just a competitor, it was an obstacle to its own destiny. This set the stage for a series of devastating conflicts known as the Punic Wars, colossal struggles that would push the Phoenician civilization to its absolute limits. The Romans were relentless, learning shipbuilding from their enemies and then defeating them at their own game. Each naval battle, each lost colony, stretched Phoenician resources thinner and thinner. They were forced to pour their wealth into building and rebuilding fleets, to defend a sprawling network that was under attack from multiple fronts. The balance of power was irrevocably broken. The masters of the sea were now fighting a desperate two-front war against rising tides of competition, one from the Greeks in the east and another, far more deadly, from the Romans in the west. How does a civilization built on trade survive when it is constantly forced to fight for its very existence? Yet even as Rome and Greece pressed from the west and east, a far more immediate and personal threat was marching south along the coast. Alexander the Great, the young conqueror who had shattered the Persian Empire, now demanded the submission of the Phoenician cities. Most opened their gates, but Tyre, the proudest of them all, made a fateful choice. Secure on its island fortress a half-mile from the shore, protected by towering walls and the finest navy in the region, its leaders refused. They believed the sea itself was their ultimate defense, a moat that no army could cross. Alexander saw it as a challenge. In an act of breathtaking audacity, he ordered his soldiers to build a road, a massive causeway, straight out across the water. They used every piece of rubble available, tearing down the buildings of the old mainland city and throwing the stones and timber into the sea to forge a path to the island. For 7 long months, the Tyrians fought back from their walls, raining down arrows and fire ships on the advancing mole. But the causeway inched closer, a testament to relentless will. When it finally reached the walls, Alexander's siege engines went to work, and the city's legendary defenses crumbled. The sack that followed was merciless. Thousands of citizens were slaughtered, and tens of thousands more were sold into slavery. The fall of Tyre was not just the destruction of a city, it was the dismantling of a nerve center. This was the place that had perfected the dye vats and controlled the flow of silver and tin, the city whose merchant princes had funded voyages beyond the Pillars of Hercules. With its population scattered and its wealth plundered, the economic heart of the Phoenician homeland simply stopped beating. The invincible island was conquered, and with it died the unshakable confidence of an entire civilization. How do you recover when the very symbol of your power lies in ruins, conquered by a man who literally moved the sea to defeat you? While the eastern homeland reeled from Alexander's conquest, the western legacy of the Phoenicians was reaching its own dramatic climax. Far across the sea, the colony of Carthage had grown into a formidable empire, a powerhouse of trade and naval strength that rivaled any in the Mediterranean. It was no longer just an outpost, it was the beating heart of the Phoenician world in the west. This ascendance made conflict with Rome inevitable. The two expanding powers collided in a series of 3 devastating conflicts known as the Punic Wars. The first 2 wars were brutal, featuring legendary generals like Hannibal, who marched his elephants over the Alps to bring the fight to Rome's doorstep. These were staggering military feats, but they ended in costly peace treaties that stripped Carthage of its fleet, its overseas territories, and its ability to wage war without Roman permission. Yet for hardliners in the Roman Senate, this was not enough. The old statesman Cato the Elder ended every speech he gave, regardless of the topic, with the same grim phrase, "Carthage must be destroyed." He saw the city not as a defeated rival, but as a perpetual threat that needed to be erased. This sentiment ultimately prevailed, leading to the Third Punic War, a conflict with a single, horrifying objective: the total annihilation of Carthage. The Romans laid siege to the city for 3 long years. When their legions finally breached the walls, they did not simply conquer, they methodically dismantled. Street by street, house by house, the great city of Carthage was torn down. Its magnificent harbor was filled with rubble, its legendary libraries burned, and its people were either slaughtered or sold into slavery by the tens of thousands. Ancient historians recount that the Romans even salted the earth around the ruins, a symbolic curse to ensure nothing would ever grow there again. The destruction was so absolute it was meant to be a lesson for all of history. With Carthage gone, the last great political entity that embodied the Phoenician spirit was extinguished. The independent flame that had burned for centuries in the Western Mediterranean was not just snuffed out, it was ground into the dust. This was more than the fall of a city, it was the systematic erasure of a sovereign power. So if the political entities are gone, what remains of a people? Their identity now faced its greatest test not on the battlefield but in the quiet, daily choices of survival. Even the most brilliant trade secrets cannot remain hidden forever. For the Phoenicians, the very heart of their wealth was a color, a deep, vibrant purple extracted from the murex sea snail. The process was a closely guarded state secret, a monopoly that had lasted for 1,000 years. It was notoriously difficult, requiring thousands of snails to produce just a single gram of dye, which made garments dyed in Tyrian purple more valuable than silver. This was not just a product, it was a symbol of ultimate status and power worn by emperors and kings. But over time, the secret leaked out. Greek and later Roman dyers learned the techniques, and while the Phoenician version was still considered the finest, the market was suddenly flooded with cheaper imitations. The exclusive brand was broken. The value of their most famous export plummeted, eroding a pillar of their economic dominance. At the same time, the entire structure of ancient commerce was shifting beneath their feet. The world was becoming more connected, and the great empires were no longer content to rely on middlemen. Rome and Ptolemaic Egypt began building their own massive merchant fleets, establishing direct trade routes to source materials like Spanish silver, British tin, and African gold. They no longer needed to pay a premium to Phoenician merchants to act as go-betweens. Furthermore, these empires introduced standardized coinage, creating vast, unified economic zones where their own currency was law. The Phoenicians, who had thrived in a world of barter and negotiated value, found themselves sidelined by these powerful, centralized systems. Their intricate web of personal contacts and specialized nautical knowledge was becoming obsolete, replaced by the brute force of imperial logistics and finance. How can you compete when your unique skills are no longer needed, and the very items that made you indispensable are now commonplace? The role they had perfected, that of the essential broker, was simply deleted from the new economic equation. A civilization's final chapter is not always written in fire and ruin. Sometimes the most profound disappearance happens quietly, in the slow surrender of a mother tongue or the fading of a prayer. Even as Phoenician cities were rebuilt and their ports buzzed with new activity, a deeper, more insidious process was unfolding, the erosion of identity itself. When a people are conquered, they face a stark choice: resist and risk destruction, or adapt to survive. For many Phoenicians, survival meant blending in. In the eastern lands of their homeland, now ruled by the Greek Seleucid Empire, the language of power and prestige shifted. To get ahead in business, to secure a position in a new administration, one had to speak Greek. The old Phoenician script, the very alphabet they had gifted to the world, began to look archaic, a symbol of a bygone era. It was chiseled less often on public monuments and used less frequently in merchant ledgers. The gods, too, began to change. Familiar Phoenician deities like Baal and Astarte were increasingly worshipped under Greek names like Zeus and Aphrodite, their identities merging with those of the conquerors. This was not a sudden, forced conversion, but a gradual, pragmatic shift. A merchant might still whisper a prayer to Baal at home, but in the public square he would honor Zeus. Over generations, this cultural bilingualism faded into a monolingual reality, and the private prayers grew quieter until they stopped altogether. In the West, a similar story played out on an even grander scale. Carthage, for all its power, was never a purely Phoenician city. To build its empire in North Africa, it had to integrate the local Berber peoples. Berber warriors filled the ranks of its armies, and Berber customs and beliefs seeped into its culture. The great goddess Tanit, who became Carthage's chief deity, was a distinct fusion of Phoenician and local North African elements. This cultural blending gave Carthage its strength and resilience, but it also meant that the Phoenician core of its identity was being steadily diluted. It was becoming something new, a hybrid entity that, while powerful, was slowly drifting from its ancestral roots. The Phoenician language, once the lingua franca of Mediterranean trade, was now being squeezed on all sides. In the East, Greek was the language of culture and administration. In the West, Latin was becoming the language of law and conquest. What use was a Phoenician scroll in a world of Greek libraries and Roman law courts? The script that had been a revolutionary tool for recording human speech was now itself becoming a relic, preserved only by priests and a few scholars, while the common people moved on. This loss was a quiet catastrophe. A people can survive the destruction of their cities and even the loss of their political freedom, but when their language falls silent and their gods are forgotten, something fundamental vanishes. The Phoenicians did not just lose their sovereignty, they began to lose the very stories they told about themselves, the shared memory that bound them together as a people. How can a civilization persist when its children no longer speak its name or remember the words of its songs? The most enduring legacy of the Phoenicians was not carved in stone or wrought in silver, but written with a reed pen on a sheet of papyrus. In a profound historical twist, the very people who faded from view gifted the world one of its most fundamental tools, their alphabet. This was not the complex, picture-based script of the Egyptians or the cumbersome cuneiform of Mesopotamia. It was something revolutionary, a system of just 24 simple symbols, each representing a single consonant sound. This was a tool of pure practicality, born from the frantic pace of the docks and the warehouse, a swift way for merchants to note cargo manifests, record debts, and seal contracts. Its genius was in its accessibility. You did not need to be a priestly scribe who had studied for decades to learn it. This was a script for the real world, and it was about to conquer the ancient world. Greek traders operating in ports like Almina on the eastern Mediterranean encountered this efficient system and immediately recognized its potential. They adopted it, but they also made a crucial adaptation. The Greek language had vowel sounds that were essential for meaning, sounds the consonant-only Phoenician script did not represent. So the Greeks repurposed some of the Phoenician letters for which their own language had no equivalent sound. They turned the Phoenician letter aleph, which represented a glottal stop, into their vowel alpha. The letter he became epsilon. With this simple yet brilliant innovation, they created the first true alphabet capable of representing every sound in a language with clarity. This hybrid system, part Phoenician skeleton and part Greek vocal spirit, proved to be explosively powerful. From the Greeks, this adapted alphabet traveled to the Etruscans in Italy, and from the Etruscans, it was passed to a rising power on the Tiber River, the Romans. They refined the letter forms into the elegant Latin script that would become the administrative engine of their vast empire. And so, the letters you are reading right now, the very shapes on this screen, carry within them a direct genetic line stretching back over 3,000 years to a Phoenician merchant scrawling a note in the port of Tyre. Every time we write a shopping list, send a text message, or read a book, we are using the intellectual inheritance of a people who otherwise vanished. Their cities may have fallen to dust and their language fallen silent, but their most practical invention became their everlasting, silent monument. It makes you wonder, what other fragments of our own civilization might quietly endure long after our names are forgotten. A people's connection to the divine is one of the strongest bonds holding a culture together. For the Phoenicians, this bond was woven into the very fabric of their city-states, centered on powerful deities like Baal, the storm god who brought the life-giving rains, and Astarte, the goddess of fertility, war, and the morning star. These were not distant figures. Their temples dominated the skylines of Tyre and Sidon, and their festivals marked the rhythm of the year, from the harvest to the sailing season. Their worship was a public and communal act that reinforced a shared Phoenician identity. But when foreign empires took control, this spiritual world faced a quiet, relentless pressure to conform. The new rulers did not typically demand the outright destruction of old gods. Instead, they pursued a more subtle and effective strategy of assimilation. They encouraged a practice known as syncretism, the blending of different religious beliefs. The Greek conquerors, for example, looked at the powerful Baal and saw their own king of the gods, Zeus. They observed the complex domains of Astarte and recognized their Aphrodite. On the surface, this seemed pragmatic, even respectful. A Phoenician merchant could continue honoring his gods simply by using their Greek names in public life. But this seemingly peaceful compromise came with a hidden cost. Over generations, the unique characteristics that made Baal distinctly Phoenician began to fade. His specific myths, his local rituals, the precise way he was worshipped, all were slowly smoothed over to fit the Greek mold of Zeus. The sacred became standardized. What was once a deeply personal relationship with a god rooted in your people's history gradually transformed into a more generic, state-sanctioned devotion. The temples themselves, the physical anchors of faith, were often rebuilt or rededicated. A temple to Baal might now have a statue of Zeus at its center, and the priests, to maintain their status and influence, would learn the new rites and prayers in Greek. This religious transformation severed a vital link to the past. The rituals that had once unified the community, that had been passed down from parent to child for 1,000 years, were now altered or abandoned altogether. When you lose the way you speak to your gods, you lose a part of your soul. The theological landscape that had defined the Phoenician coast for centuries was being irrevocably redrawn, not by a single edict, but by the slow, daily choices of a people simply trying to get by in a new world. If the gods themselves can change their names, what else must be left behind? Even the sturdiest of ships can be sunk by a slow, unseen leak. While empires clashed on the sea and the battlefield, a quieter, more fundamental struggle was unfolding along the Phoenician coast. The very land that nurtured their civilization began to turn against them. Geological records tell a story of violent upheaval, pointing to a massive earthquake that rocked the region sometime in the 2nd century before the Common Era. This was not a minor tremor. It struck at the heart of their homeland, inflicting catastrophic damage on vital cities like Sidon. Imagine the chaos, the toppled columns, the crushed warehouses along the waterfront, the shattered docks that were the lifeblood of their trade. Recovering from such a disaster required immense resources and labor, resources that were already being stretched thin by constant warfare and economic pressure. A city struggling to rebuild its own walls is in no position to project power across the Mediterranean, but the earth was not the only element pushing back. The Phoenicians' own success contained the seeds of an ecological crisis. For centuries, they had harvested the great cedar forests of Lebanon to build their legendary fleets. The wood was perfect, strong, and resistant to rot, the backbone of every galley that sailed from their ports. Yet this was a finite resource, and the demand was relentless. Ship after ship, generation after generation, the axes bit deeper into the mountainsides. Over time, this led to widespread deforestation. The loss of those trees was more than just the loss of lumber, it was the unraveling of an ecosystem. Without the deep root systems to hold the soil, erosion would have swept down the hillsides, potentially silting up the very ports they depended on and degrading the agricultural land that fed their cities. They were, in a very real sense, sawing off the branch they were sitting on. These environmental blows did not deliver the final knockout punch to Phoenician power, but they critically weakened its foundations. A society reeling from a natural disaster and grappling with a dwindling resource base is far less capable of resisting the determined advance of a Roman legion or recovering from the next economic shock. The environment did not destroy them, but it left them exposed, turning a slow decline into an irreversible fade. Alexander the Great's empire did not long survive its creator, but the world he forged endured. After his death, his generals, known as the Diadochi, tore his domain apart in a brutal struggle for the pieces. The Phoenician coast, the ancient homeland, became a prize for one of the most powerful of these successor states, the Seleucid Empire. This was not merely a change of overlords, it was the beginning of a systematic and thorough cultural overhaul. The Seleucids were not just conquerors, they were evangelists for a Hellenistic way of life. They believed in the superiority of Greek culture, and they set about remaking the lands they controlled in its image. Phoenician cities were systematically refounded or renamed as Greek polis, city-states modeled on the Athenian ideal. A citizen of Sidon or Tyre might now find his home officially designated as a Greek city, with all the political institutions and public spaces that implied. The language of administration, of the courts, and of high culture shifted decisively to Greek. For the local Phoenician elite, the merchant families, and the old aristocracy, this presented a stark choice. To retain their influence, their wealth, and their social standing, they had to play by the new rules. They sent their sons to Greek schools to learn rhetoric and philosophy. They built gymnasiums, the social hubs of the Greek world, where young men exercised and socialized, often in the nude, a deeply foreign custom. They began to speak Greek at home, not just in the marketplace. This was a top-down cultural revolution, and it was devastatingly effective. The vibrant, distinct character of the Phoenician cities, once defined by their smoky dye vats and the clatter of shipyards, began to fade beneath a veneer of Hellenistic marble and colonnaded streets. They were becoming nodes in a vast, interconnected Greek-speaking world, their unique political and cultural identity dissolving into a broader, homogenized imperial culture. The pressure to assimilate was now official state policy, and resisting it meant social and economic oblivion. How do you hold on to your heritage when the path to success requires you to publicly abandon it? Rome's approach was one of cold, systematic efficiency. Having witnessed the tenacity of Carthage, they had no intention of allowing another cohesive power to rise from the same cultural roots. So when the Roman legions finally marched into the old Phoenician heartland, now a worn-out piece of the crumbling Seleucid Empire, they did not seek to destroy the cities. Instead, they dismantled the very idea of a unified Phoenicia. The Romans sliced the coastline into smaller administrative districts, folding them into the vast new province of Syria. Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos were no longer sister cities in a loose confederation of merchant princes. They were now just individual towns in separate Roman districts, competing for the favor of a distant governor. This political fragmentation was a masterstroke of control. It severed the ancient lines of communication and kinship that had once bound these ports together. A merchant from Sidon now had to deal with a different Roman official than his cousin in Tyre. their shared heritage meaning nothing in the ledgers of imperial administration. The Romans were brilliant at absorbing the strengths of conquered peoples, and they recognized the immense value of these deep water harbors and the generations of nautical skill possessed by the local population. Phoenician sailors, the descendants of the men who had first charted the Mediterranean, now found themselves at the oars of Roman-grain ships or serving as pilots for the imperial navy. Their shipyards, once the source of vessels that challenged empires, were put to work maintaining the supply lines that fed Rome itself. The infrastructure of a maritime superpower was not demolished. It was simply repurposed, its every bolt and timber now serving a foreign master. The Phoenician people, as a political force, were not just defeated, they were administratively erased, broken into harmless pieces, and then absorbed into the relentless machine of Rome. How do you rebel when your identity has been filed away in separate cabinets, and your greatest skills are now tools for your conqueror's glory? There was no single day when the Phoenicians ceased to exist. The idea of a sudden, dramatic vanishing is a compelling myth, but the reality was far more gradual and complex. Their story is not one of a light being switched off, but of a sunset that stretched for centuries, the colors shifting so slowly you would hardly notice the growing dark. The first and most visible loss was political independence, stripped away by the conquests of Alexander and the systematic dismantling by Rome. But even after their cities were no longer their own, the Phoenician people continued. They still traded, they still sailed, they still raised families. The next layer to fade was their economic dominance, as the world no longer needed their unique role as middlemen. Yet even then, their communities persisted. The final and most profound loss was the slow erosion of cultural identity, a process measured not in battles but in the quiet choices of daily life. A merchant might teach his son the family business, but he would also ensure the boy learned Greek to negotiate with officials. A daughter might hear the old stories of the goddess Astarte from her grandmother, but she would see her worshipped as Aphrodite in the public square. Generation by generation, the pull to blend in, to secure a better future within the new empires, grew stronger. The vibrant purple of their distinct culture was slowly washed out, not by a single deluge, but by a relentless, gentle rain of assimilation. This is the true nature of their disappearance, a long, slow transformation where the people remained, but the civilization they built quietly faded from within. So did the Phoenicians truly vanish, or did they simply learn to wear new faces? The answer lies not just in crumbling scrolls, but in the very bloodlines of people living today. Modern genetic science has begun to trace the ghostly outline of that ancient maritime people in the DNA of modern populations. Studies focusing on the Y chromosome, passed down largely unchanged from father to son, have identified distinct markers that are exceptionally common in men from coastal Lebanon, the Phoenician heartland. These same genetic signatures appear like echoes across the Mediterranean, found at elevated levels in Malta, Cyprus, Sicily, and the coasts of Spain and Tunisia, all key hubs of Phoenician trade and colonization. This is not evidence of a sudden extinction, but of a slow genetic diffusion. The sailors and merchants did not dissolve into thin air. They settled, they traded, and they raised families, weaving their DNA into the fabric of new societies. Their biological legacy persists, a silent, living monument to their vast network of voyages. Beneath the bustling streets of modern Lebanese cities, archaeology tells a parallel story of continuity. Excavations in places like Sidon and Tyre reveal not a single layer of glorious ruins capped by a layer of foreign ash, but a deep, complex cake of human history. One stratum holds the foundations of a Phoenician merchant's house, the next a mosaic floor from a Roman villa, followed by the walls of a Byzantine church, and then the foundations of an Islamic palace. The cities were not abandoned, they were endlessly recycled, each new culture building literally upon the bones of the last. The Phoenician people were always there, adapting their architecture, their language, and their faith to the latest wave of conquerors. They became the Roman citizens who exported olive oil, the Byzantine Christians who prayed in churches built over temples to Baal, and the Arab traders who continued to use these same excellent harbors. Their distinct political and cultural identity was ultimately submerged, but the people themselves never left. They simply flowed into the next chapter of history, their descendants walking the same sun-drenched shores today, carrying within them the indelible mark of their ancient ancestors. Carthage stands as a powerful exception to the slow fade of its ancestors. This city began its life as a simple colony, a daughter of Tyre sent to secure a strategic harbor on the North African coast. But over the centuries, it grew into something far greater than its mother city could ever have imagined. It developed its own government, its own empire, and most importantly, its own unique identity. The people of Carthage did not stop being Phoenician, but they began to be something more. They became Punic, a name derived from the Roman word for them, a label that came to signify a vibrant hybrid culture. This new identity was forged in the crucible of North Africa, where Phoenician settlers lived alongside and intermarried with the local Berber peoples. Berber warriors became the backbone of the Carthaginian army, and Berber spiritual beliefs began to blend with those brought from the eastern homeland. The great goddess Tanit, who rose to become the paramount deity of Carthage, is a perfect symbol of this fusion. She shared attributes with the Phoenician Astarte, but her distinct symbols, like the mysterious sign of Tanit, a stylized figure with arms raised to a crescent moon, are uniquely Punic, found everywhere in Carthage but rarely in the Levant. Even their language, while still a Phoenician dialect, developed its own local character. By the time Hannibal was marching his elephants toward Rome, the citizens of Carthage saw themselves as their own people, the masters of the Western Mediterranean, connected to the Old World by history and trade, but no longer defined by it. This profound evolution means that when Rome finally erased Carthage from the map, it was not simply the end of a Phoenician colony. It was the annihilation of a distinct Punic civilization, a powerful and unique culture that, while sprouted from Phoenician seed, had grown into a separate and formidable tree. Its destruction was a final, brutal punctuation mark on one branch of the story, even as the root stock back in the east continued its own, quieter transformation. This reliance on outside voices creates a fundamental problem for anyone trying to hear the Phoenicians themselves. We are forced to piece together their story from the accounts of their rivals, who often had every reason to cast them in an unflattering light. Greek historians sometimes depicted them as cunning and deceitful merchants, a stereotype born from commercial jealousy. Roman chroniclers, writing to justify the brutal destruction of Carthage, portrayed the Carthaginians as inherently treacherous and cruel, even accusing them of child sacrifice on a massive scale, a charge that modern archaeology continues to debate hotly. These are not neutral observations, they are propaganda, designed to make the enemy seem monstrous and their conquest seem righteous. Imagine trying to write the biography of a famous person using only the diaries of their business competitors and political opponents. You would get a picture, certainly, but it would be warped by envy, fear, and a vested interest in their downfall. This is the shaky foundation upon which much of Phoenician history is built. The irony is profound. The very people who gave the world a practical alphabet, a tool meant for recording and communication, left behind so few of their own written words for posterity. Their most important documents were not carved in stone for the gods, but inked on scrolls for the counting house and the ship's log. They wrote on papyrus, a fragile material perfect for the busy port city, but hopeless against the damp climate of the Mediterranean and the relentless passage of time. A royal Egyptian inscription on a tomb wall could survive for millennia in the dry desert air, but a Phoenician merchant's contract, stored in a humid warehouse in Tyre, would turn to dust within centuries. So while we have the grand narratives of their conquerors, we have lost the mundane paperwork of their lives, the day-to-day records that would tell us what they truly valued, how they governed their cities, and how they saw their own place in the world. This silence forces historians to become detectives, reading between the lines of biased texts and relying heavily on the silent testimony of archaeology, on the broken pottery, the foundation stones of houses, and the traces of ancient shipwrecks. The Phoenicians did not so much vanish as they faded into a silence partly of their own making, a civilization that mastered the written word but chose not to use it to shout its own story into the future. The world's economic currents were slowly but decisively rerouting, leaving the Phoenician coast stranded on a receding shoreline. For centuries, their wealth had been guaranteed by geography, their ports serving as the only gateways between the great empires of the East and the eager markets of the West. That monopoly was about to shatter. Far to the east, a network of caravan trails was stitching together a new reality, the Silk Road. This was not a single path but a sprawling web of overland routes that allowed silk, spices, and other luxuries to travel directly from China and India through Central Asia and into the hands of Greek and Roman merchants. Suddenly, a merchant in Rome could acquire Chinese silk without a single Phoenician ship ever touching the cargo. The sea was being bypassed by the desert and the mountain pass, and the Phoenicians' role as the essential maritime middlemen was dramatically diminished. At the same time, a new maritime giant rose to block their eastern horizon. The Ptolemies of Egypt, with immense wealth and ambition, built the city of Alexandria into the greatest commercial hub the ancient world had ever seen. Its legendary lighthouse beckoned ships from across the Mediterranean, while its massive, protected harbor could accommodate entire fleets. More importantly, the Ptolemies aggressively funneled trade through their own territory. They established direct sea routes to India, using the monsoon winds to sail across the open ocean, cutting out the old coastal hopping journeys that had always depended on Phoenician ports for resupply. The Phoenician cities, once the bustling, unavoidable crossroads where east met west, were now just stops on a side road, while the main highway of global commerce ran through Alexandria and over the Silk Road. How do you maintain your economic relevance when the world deliberately builds a new road that goes around your house? This deep-seated independence, the very engine of their commercial success, became their greatest strategic weakness. Unlike the Romans or the Egyptians, the Phoenicians never saw themselves as a single nation. They were a constellation of rival ports, each with its own king, its own fleet, and its own bottom line. Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos were more like competing corporations than sister cities in a unified state. Their primary loyalty was to their own harbor, their own merchant families, and their own profit margins. When a foreign army appeared on the horizon, the instinct was not to unite and form a grand alliance. It was to calculate, could a rival city be sacrificed to buy time? Could a separate, more favorable deal be struck with the invader to preserve one's own wealth and power? This is precisely what happened when Alexander the Great marched down the coast. The leaders of Sidon, who had long chafed under Tyrian dominance, saw an opportunity. They opened their gates to the conqueror, welcoming him as a liberator. They even provided ships from their own fleet to help him besiege their rival, Tyre. It was a cold, pragmatic decision, a business calculation in the face of an overwhelming force. From Sidon's perspective, it was better to be on the winning side and perhaps inherit Tyre's trade routes than to stand together and be destroyed. This pattern repeated itself again and again. There was no Phoenician Leonidas to rally a united stand at a narrow pass, no central treasury to fund a common army, no singular voice to negotiate for their entire civilization. When Rome threatened, each city assessed the danger in isolation, hoping to cut a deal that would save itself, even if it meant the eventual downfall of all the others. How can you win a war when your own allies are secretly negotiating their surrender? This fatal disunity meant that the powerful, centralized empires they faced never had to fight the Phoenicians, only individual Phoenician cities, one at a time. It was a slow, systematic dismemberment of a civilization that never truly learned to speak with one voice. Their voice may have faded from the markets and temples, but it never fully vanished from human memory. It simply found a new home, hidden in plain sight within the languages that replaced it. The legacy of the Phoenicians is embedded in the very words we use today, like linguistic fossils waiting to be discovered. Consider the word Bible. This sacred text gets its name not from Jerusalem or Rome, but from a Phoenician port. The Greek word for book was biblos, a direct reference to the city of Byblos, which was so renowned for its high-quality papyrus exports that its name became synonymous with the material itself. So, every time someone refers to the Bible, they are unconsciously invoking the memory of a Phoenician city whose merchants turned Egyptian reeds into a global commodity. Even more mundane is the word sack, as in a bag. This common term is thought to trace its lineage directly back to the Phoenician word sack, a sturdy bag used for transporting goods like grain or spices across the Mediterranean. These are not grand monuments, but they are perhaps more enduring. They are the ghostly echoes of a mercantile people in our daily speech, proof that their practical needs for labeling and logistics shaped the vocabulary of the ancient world and, through it, our own. The sacks that carried their grain and the papyrus that recorded their deals became so essential to daily life that their names outlasted the empire that popularized them. This is a different kind of immortality, one found not in ruined harbors, but on the pages of a book and in the simple words we use to describe the world around us. Their genius for the sea was far too valuable to be lost. While their political power faded, the brilliant naval technology they pioneered lived on, absorbed and perfected by the very empires that overshadowed them. The most iconic of these innovations were their multi-leveled warships, the bireme and later the trireme. Before the Phoenicians, most galleys were simple, single-decked vessels. Their breakthrough was to stack oarsmen, creating a ship that was both incredibly fast and formidably powerful for its size. The bireme, with 2 banks of oars, and the trireme, with 3, became the ultimate projection of naval force in the ancient world. These were not just boats, they were floating fortresses, their bronze-clad rams capable of splintering an enemy hull with a single, well-aimed blow. When the Greeks and later the Romans saw these vessels in action, they immediately recognized their superiority. They did not reinvent the wheel, they simply copied the Phoenician blueprint. Greek shipwrights refined the design, making the trireme even sleeker and more agile, but the core concept, the stacked oarsmen driving a ramming warship, was a Phoenician invention. This means that when the Greek fleet stood against the Persians at the Battle of Salamis, they did so in ships whose basic DNA was Phoenician. The very tools used to build classical empires were inherited from the master shipwrights of Tyre and Sidon. Beyond the ships themselves, their most vital knowledge was written in the stars. Venturing beyond the sight of land required a courage and skill most ancient peoples lacked. The Phoenicians became the first great celestial navigators of the Mediterranean. they learned to read the night sky, using the constellations as a fixed map in the heavens. The North Star, Polaris, became their constant guide, an unmoving point of reference in the northern sky that told them their latitude. They studied the seasonal shifts of other stars and the predictable path of the sun, allowing them to plot courses across vast, empty stretches of water with a confidence that seemed like magic to their contemporaries. This sophisticated understanding did not die with their independence. It was passed along trade routes, taught to Greek and Egyptian pilots, and eventually compiled into the first sailing manuals. The foundational science of Mediterranean navigation, the very knowledge that allowed for the expansion of every subsequent sea power from Rome to Venice, was built upon a Phoenician framework. Their ships were captured and replicated, and their stars were learned by new generations of sailors. In the creak of a trireme's oars and in the navigator's upward glance, the legacy of the Phoenicians sailed on, silent but indispensable partners in every voyage that followed. That famous purple dye casts a long shadow, one that often obscures the true breadth of their genius. It is easy to label them simply as the Purple People, a civilization defined by a single, magnificent color. But this is like describing a vast library by the leather of its bindings, missing the wealth of knowledge held within. While the dye vats of Tyre were indeed economic powerhouses, they were just one room in a much larger and more sophisticated workshop. In the fiery heat of their furnaces, they were also the ancient world's master glassmakers. They perfected the art of glassblowing, transforming sand into everything from delicate perfume bottles to transparent vessels that were marvels of their time. Their workshops produced vivid colored glass that mimicked precious stones, and they are even credited with creating the first glass masks. Beyond glass, their artisans shaped precious metals into intricate jewelry and finely detailed ceremonial bowls, often inlaid with delicate scenes of gods and monsters. They were renowned for their ivory carvers, who transformed elephant tusks into exquisite cosmetic boxes, furniture inlays, and small sculptures that were coveted by royalty from Assyria to Egypt. These were not just craftsmen, they were artists and engineers whose work required a deep understanding of chemistry, metallurgy, and aesthetics. To reduce this entire civilization to the color purple is to ignore its role as a cradle of high art and advanced technology. The real tragedy of their decline is not merely the loss of a monopoly on a dye, but the silencing of countless workshops where this diverse creativity once flourished. It was the end of a vibrant, multifaceted world of innovation, a loss far greater than the fading of a single color from the world's palette. This disappearance follows a different historical rhythm than most. We often think of lost civilizations in terms of dramatic finales, like the volcanic ash that froze Pompeii in a single day or the swift conquest that toppled the Aztec Empire. The Spanish conquistadors subjugated the Aztecs, yet the distinct imprint of that culture endures powerfully in modern Mexico, from the language of Nahuatl to the vibrant traditions that survive. The Phoenician story lacks that kind of clean, catastrophic break. Theirs was not a sudden collapse but a slow dissolve into the cultural solvent of the Greco-Roman world. They did not vanish in a battle or a natural disaster. They faded through 1,000 acts of daily assimilation. Think of it as the difference between a building being demolished by an explosion versus being dismantled brick by brick over centuries, with each stone reused in new constructions until the original blueprint is completely forgotten. The Aztec Empire was felled, but its people and many of its cultural pillars remained visibly standing. The Phoenician people also remained, but the pillars of their unique identity, their political structures, their language, and their religious practices were so thoroughly repurposed by Greece and Rome that their original form was erased. Their fate was a profound merging, a cultural blending so complete that it led to a unique form of historical obscurity. Why is it that some conquered peoples retain a strong identity while others seem to melt away? The answer may lie not in the force of the conquest, but in the very nature of the civilization being conquered. The Phoenicians, as a network of merchant cities without a strong, unifying national myth, were perhaps always more adaptable, more ready to adopt a new face if it meant preserving their commercial livelihood. This adaptability, the very trait that made them such successful traders, ultimately made them far more susceptible to being absorbed without a trace. They did not fall, they simply flowed into the currents of history, leaving behind a ghostly outline rather than a ruined city wall. Their land was a thin strip of fertility squeezed between the mountains and the sea. Unlike the sprawling wheat fields of Egypt or the river valleys of Mesopotamia, the Phoenician heartland offered no vast plains for surplus grain. Every inch of arable soil was precious, carved into painstaking terraces that climbed the steep hillsides. These stone-walled steps held back the soil, capturing every drop of rain to nurture vineyards for their famous wine, groves of olive trees, and gardens of precious fruits. This was not farming on an imperial scale. It was a meticulous local effort, a constant negotiation with a rugged landscape. Their ability to feed their own bustling port cities was always balanced on a knife's edge. While history records no great famine that toppled their civilization, scientists studying ancient climate patterns see a gradual trend. The region appears to have become slowly drier over centuries, a creeping aridity that would have made those terraced farms even more difficult to work. The rains may have been less reliable, the springs a little weaker. In such an environment, a few poor harvests in a row could strain the entire system. This underlying agricultural limitation shaped their destiny from the very beginning. It was the primary reason they turned to the sea, transforming from farmers into merchants out of necessity. But in their twilight years, this same limitation became a critical vulnerability. A city like Tyre, built on an island, was utterly dependent on shipments of food from the mainland. When Alexander the Great built his causeway, he was not just building a road, he was enacting a brutal blockade. The city's fate was sealed not just by the breach in its walls, but by the empty stomachs within. A civilization that could not feed itself from its own land was always at the mercy of whoever controlled the sea lanes and the coastal roads. Their incredible commercial network was both their greatest strength and their most dangerous weakness, a lifeline that, when cut, left their urban hearts to starve. How resilient can any society be when its breadbasket lies on the other side of a hostile army? For centuries, the Phoenicians were little more than a ghostly name mentioned in Greek and Roman chronicles, a civilization of rumor and legend. Then, in the 19th century, a new kind of detective work began to stir the dust of ancient sites. This was the dawn of modern archaeology, a discipline driven by a desire to dig for truth, not just treasure. The first major breakthroughs came in the Old Heartland, at Sidon and Tyre, where teams of European and local archaeologists began to peel back the layers of earth. They found not the grand columned temples of Greece, but something far more telling: the foundations of warehouses, the outlines of dye vats stained a faint, eternal purple, and the stone-lined tanks of ancient harbors. These were the physical bones of a commercial empire, but the most dramatic revelations came from the west, from the site of Carthage itself. For generations, people had doubted the Roman stories, wondering if the city's grandeur was just an exaggeration. The excavations proved the Romans had understated its scale. Archaeologists uncovered a massive, circular naval harbor, a masterpiece of military engineering, and the sprawling residential quarters of a metropolis that had housed hundreds of thousands. The ground itself confirmed the city's brutal end, revealing a thick, charred layer of destruction that ran for acres, a silent testament to the finality of the Roman siege. Yet the single most important discovery was not a building, but a written word. In the ruins of Byblos, a royal sarcophagus was unearthed belonging to a king named Ahiram. Carved into its stone lid was an inscription, a curse written in a script scholars had seen but could not fully understand. This was the Phoenician alphabet, the very one they had given to the world. The painstaking decipherment of these letters was the final key. For the first time, the Phoenicians could speak for themselves, even if only in a few brief sentences. That ancient curse warning against disturbing the king's rest was not just a message from beyond the grave, it was a voice emerging from 2,000 years of silence. Archaeology had done more than just find their artifacts. It had given them back their voice, allowing their story to be rebuilt not from the biased accounts of their enemies, but from the very stones they had walked upon. One of the darkest shadows cast over their legacy is the grim question of child sacrifice. Ancient writers, particularly the Romans, describe the practice in horrifying detail, depicting Carthaginian parents willingly offering their infants to the god Baal-Hamon, placing them in the arms of a bronze statue that would tilt forward, dropping the child into a fiery pit below. These accounts were long dismissed as pure propaganda, the ultimate slander from a civilization that wanted to justify the utter annihilation of its rival. For centuries, it was easier to believe that the Romans had simply made it all up. Then, archaeologists began digging at a place called the Tophet, a sacred precinct on the outskirts of ancient Carthage. What they found was deeply unsettling. They uncovered thousands of small, sealed urns, each containing the cremated bones of very young children, sometimes only a few weeks old. Mixed in with these were the bones of young animals, lambs, and kids, presumably offered as substitutes. The inscriptions on the accompanying stone markers are chillingly consistent, bearing a standard vow, a pledge made to a god in return for a favor. The stones do not say the child died of sickness, they say it was vowed, a gift given. While a few scholars still argue this was merely a special cemetery for infants who died naturally, the sheer scale of the Tophet, the specific ritual language, and the presence of animal substitutes point toward a different, more somber conclusion. This was likely a real and established religious practice, one so alien to our modern sensibilities and so shocking to their Greek and Roman contemporaries that it became a powerful tool for their enemies. It painted the Carthaginians not just as rivals but as monstrous, a people whose religious devotion crossed a line that even ancient warfare respected. This dark chapter forces us to confront a difficult truth about how we remember lost civilizations. We often romanticize the past, but history is not always a story of noble ancestors. Sometimes the echoes that return to us are not just of shipbuilders and traders, but of a faith so absolute, so terrifying, that it could consume its own future. The story of the Phoenicians is a lesson in how a civilization can dissolve into history without a single, defining catastrophe. Their end was not a sudden collapse but a gradual fading, a complex tapestry where the threads of military defeat, economic irrelevance, and cultural absorption slowly unraveled their distinct identity. Their political sovereignty was crushed beneath the heels of Alexander and the relentless efficiency of Rome. Their legendary trade monopolies were shattered by competitors and new global routes. Their language and gods were quietly folded into the dominant cultures of the Hellenistic and Roman worlds, until the people who remained no longer called themselves Phoenician. And yet, to say they vanished is to misunderstand their legacy. They achieved a different kind of immortality. Their greatest inventions became so fundamental, so woven into the fabric of later civilizations, that their origin was forgotten. The alphabet you used to read these words, the very concept of an alphabet, was their practical gift. The foundational principles of open water navigation that guided every subsequent sea power were charted first by their pilots. They did not disappear, they transformed, their essence living on in the silent architecture of our communication and exploration. The Phoenicians remind us that some civilizations end not with a bang, but with a whisper, their most brilliant achievements becoming the invisible bedrock of the world that follows. What other lost histories are waiting to be rediscovered, their stories hidden just beneath the sands of time? Share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe to journey with us into more historical mysteries.